Hey, Slater Crusaders, America's the greatest country in the world. Thanks for being here. What an honor today to take some time to learn about Israel and the Palestinian territories and who these people are and what this conflict is all about. All right, getting the history that we need to make sense of what's going on today. Just tell you where I am. Just looking back at my life when it comes to peace in the Middle East, right? And it's always been like a joke, right? It's what beauty queens wish for when they're doing their interview portion on stage at the Miss America pageant, right? Peace in the Middle East. And it's funny because it's impossible. But obviously the truth is it's not funny because people are dying and people are living in fear. And what's so frustrating about it is it's not necessary. It's not necessary. Peace has been offered many times before, and the Palestinian leadership has rejected it, and they prefer war. The leadership prefers war because they get in power. They get more power. They stay in power by demanding that Israel be eliminated completely, as opposed to just accepting some terms and what they call a two-state solution. It's just like anything, right? You have the leaders, and it's a smaller group, but they're the most extreme, and they have the power, and they have the influence. The former Miss Iraq, speaking of beauty pageants, from the Miss Universe pageant, she had to flee Iraq in 2017 because she took a picture with Miss Israel, right? So Miss Iraq and Miss Israel, they took pictures next to each other, and Miss Iraq had to leave the country. Well, she's become an activist, an outspoken supporter of Israel. She said 25% of the global Muslim population wants to destroy Israel. So she says 25%. Here's the quote. She said, radical Islamist ideologies that teach them that Jews are not even human beings. They're satanic creatures in human form. The amount of anti-Semitism that exists in radical Islam, it's crazy. It's exactly like the Nazi movement. And that's why a lot of Islamists have joined their movement with the neo-Nazis in order to defeat Jews all over the world. It gets more complicated to understand when the left here in America embraces the Palestinian cause, which is so bizarre because, as we'll talk about in the special today, the Palestinian leadership is against every single American and Western and democratic value that exists. Right? So how can you have these people in America who say, well, that's the key, right? They say they support democracy, and then they go and they support the Palestinians. They say they support women's rights and gay rights and human rights, and then they go and they support the Palestinians. That doesn't make any sense. So here's Bill Maher, of all people, the other day speaking on that.
It's amazing to me that the progressives think that they're being progressive by taking that side of it, the Bella Hadids of the world, these influencers. I just want to say, in February of this year, a Hamas court ruled that an unmarried woman cannot travel in Gaza without the permission of a male guardian. Really? That's where the progressives are. Bella Hadid and her friends would run screaming to Tel Aviv if they had to live in Gaza for one day.
Right. But, I mean...
Amazing. We played a clip the other day of the Black Lives Matter founder, Patrisse Cullors, talking about her support for the Palestinians. And no one at the Harvard Law School audience rose their hand and said, Patrisse, excuse me, if you went to Gaza, you wouldn't be allowed to drive. And then someone else would stand up and say, drive, you would never get in a car because they would throw you off a building because you're gay. Not be allowed to drive a car because you're a woman, you wouldn't be allowed to live because you're gay. I know we're heavy on the Bill Maher, but it's encouraging and refreshing to hear someone on the left support Israel. Because oddly, that's not the case a lot today. So here's Bill Maher with just a quick history lesson that we're going to break down a little bit more coming up in the next segment. But here's Bill Maher.
I would submit that Israel did not steal anybody's land. This is another thing I've heard the last couple of weeks, words like occupiers. and colonizers and apartheid, which I don't think people understand the history there. The Jews have been in that area of the world since about 1200 BC, way before the first Muslim or Arab walked the earth, 1,000 years before. I mean, Jerusalem was their capital. Okay, so if it's just about who got there first, it's not even close. There have been a continuous Jewish presence. Yes, the Jews were the ones who were occupied by everybody. The Romans took over at some point, and then the Persians and the Byzantines, and then the Ottomans. So yes, there was colonization going on there. Beginning in the 20th, 19th century, they started to return to Palestine, which was never an Arab country. There was never a country called Palestine that was a distinct Arab country.
I wonder, did the quote-unquote Palestinian people care when they were occupied by the British or by the Turks in the Ottoman Empire, any of these other occupying forces? That's when the UN came in 1946-47 and said, yeah, we're going to partition this land up for Israel. And they gave the Palestinians a huge chunk of land. They offered them, and they refused to take it because they didn't want the Jews to control any of it. There's a meme going around that the Jews took the land in 1948. And you're like, guys, I don't even know how you responded. Like, have you ever read the Bible? Like, I don't. And they talk about apartheid and colonization and occupation. Like, no. Here's an example of colonization. When the Brits sail around the world and take over India or South Africa, right? That's the famous example. People they have no connection with whatsoever. The Brits had no connection to the people of South Africa, but they took it over and kept people separated, and certain people had no rights, and certain people had no connections to anything in the government or economy or anything like that, weren't allowed to do certain things. That's what occupation is. That's what colonization is. This is not even close to what's happening in Israel. This is the fact that blew the top off it for me. It would be one thing if in Israel only Jews were allowed to live there. If you would go to Israel and only Jews were allowed in, no Arabs, no Muslims, no Christians even, just Jews, then you'd be like, okay. But that's not true. There are Arabs in the Israeli military. There's Arabs in the Israeli government. There's Arabs living peacefully inside of Israel. But in the Palestinian territories, no Jews allowed. That's all you need to know, isn't it? But look how you're being deceived, right? Just like our American media spreads communist propaganda, Chinese propaganda. They spread Palestinian propaganda as well. We're going to talk more about this coming up in our third segment of today's show. But the New York Times the other day ran a headline called "They Were Only Children," written by Mona El Nagar, Adam Raskan, and Mona Boshnak. They were only children. And they show the faces of all these kids who have been killed in the Palestinian territories by the Israelis. Now, a couple things. First, one of the 17-year-olds that they show turned out to be a terrorist in the Mujahideen brigades. And the New York Times had to come back and admit, he was, and it's against international law to use minors in armed conflicts, but they did there. So they had to come back and do a little mea culpa on that. But the story that they had with these pictures had no context of how these kids were killed. Mostly because these terrorists in the Palestinian territories, the terrorists, they keep their weapons underneath schools. They keep their weapons underneath hospitals. They keep their weapons in residential neighborhoods. So what are you to do? What's Israel to do? And the New York Times went on to say it's just not fair because in Gaza, people don't have access to bomb shelters like they do in Israel. Not enough equity of bomb shelters. Or how about we have the Palestinian leadership stop lobbing missiles in Israel? How about that? No? Not. That's not. Trump put a stop to all this. It was as simple as having a strong leader in America for Israel, and the terrorists stopped. That's the language they speak, strength. As soon as Biden took over, the fighting kicked up again. It's no accident. It's our special today. Coming up next, we'll talk about the current political climate inside of Israel, but then also the history of that piece of land. We'll start there. Coming up next, Stand with Israel. Mike Slater, true story. Spread the word. Hey, Slater Crusaders, welcome back to our special Stand with Israel. I want to talk about the history of Israel and that piece of land. I want to make sure we get a firm understanding of that and the peoples there. But before we get to the history, let's talk a little bit about the present and the current prime minister and the government of Israel and understand how that works and how that relates to our government and our relationship with Israel. And to do that, we'll talk with Professor Ido Aharoni, NYU professor of international relations. He's at APCO Worldwide, and he's the chair of the Charney Forum for New Diplomacy. Mr. Aharoni, how are you, sir?
Very good, very good. Nice to be on your show. Thank you for having me.
Good to talk to you, Ambassador. So let's talk about Benjamin Netanyahu, his last, what has been 12 years as prime minister. What's your assessment of his job performance, and what's the future for him and for the politics of Israel?
Well, you know, like many things in Israeli politics, it's very, very difficult to assess because he's far from concluding his legacy. He is the longest serving prime minister, although when you compare him, of course, to David Ben-Gurion, you have to remember that Ben-Gurion was at the helm for 27 years, with the exception of a couple of years when he retired and came back. So he is the longest serving leader of the state of Israel, not the longest serving leader of the Zionist movement. It's important to note that in Israel, the system is dramatically different than the American system. We do not have a presidential system. People do not elect an individual, but rather a political platform. And it looks like that the political platform that supports Benjamin Netanyahu failed 4 times in a row to gain a parliamentary majority, which means that there's a very good chance that Mr. Netanyahu will probably end this phase of his career. He enjoys a great deal of appreciation from Israelis and leaders worldwide, but I think a combination of too long of a term with certain fatigue brought some of his staunchest allies on the right side of the Israeli spectrum to actually give a hand to his ouster.
Okay, so, and I know this is tricky because how would you describe what party or platform is raising an influence from an American's perspective, right? And I know it's kind of weird because the paradigms may be different of left and right and whatever, but who's gaining more power in Israeli politics?
Excellent question. Look, in years before, the defining question that really was critical and was at the core of the Israeli political discourse is, where do you stand on the Israeli-Palestinian question? And if you were in favor of the two-state solution, it meant that you're left of center and vice versa. What happened was 3 very dramatic events. The first is the fact that the Palestinians declined Bill Clinton's compromise in the summer of 2000. Second was the Palestinians rejected practically the Gaza pullout, which was a handover of Gaza to the Palestinians by Ariel Sharon in August of 2005. They used it as a platform to repeated attacks against Israel. And lastly, 2008, Ehud Olmert is making a proposal which would have given the Palestinians 100% of all of their territorial demands, and they did not even bother to answer his proposal. The combination of all 3 events created a new division within Israeli public. Forget the political system. The Israeli public is now looking at the Palestinian conflict as a secondary issue. What is the number one issue that people are concerned with? The chaos, lack of governance, the dysfunctionality of the government. These are the reasons why parties that were natural allies of Benjamin Netanyahu are now joining forces with others to get him out of the government, because they feel the government and the country is not being properly managed. It has nothing to do with the Palestinians. I'll tell you more than that. It looks like for the first time in Israel's history, an Arab party is going to be part of the coalition, which means they're going to have access to major budgets. They're going to have a piece of the national pie. And I think it's a good thing for the state.
That's okay. So that is an amazing point. And we just talked about this in our opening segment. I think all anyone needs to know, and correct me if I'm wrong, Ambassador, about if you don't know anything about Israel and the Palestinian territories, blah, 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 the fact that no Jews are allowed in the Palestinian territories, but there are Arabs in the Israeli military and Israeli government. Like, that's all you need to know. So tell me about that. That's wild that there are Arabs not only in the government, but now you say, how do you word that, even in like the majority coalition?
Yeah, I mean, the whole notion of, look, one of the biggest problems and challenges that Israel has is the complexity of the situation. People make fun of it. They say, oh, it's not that complex. It's very simple. And they buy into this colonialist narrative. The truth is that we have nearly 2 million Israeli Arab citizens. All public opinion surveys indicate that the vast majority of them are actually very happy being part of the Jewish state. Many of them, more than 70% of them, say that they're proud being Israeli. You'll find them in our national sporting teams. You'll find them in the Supreme Court. You'll find them in the parliament. You'll find them now in the government. You'll find them in the police. You'll find them everywhere. They are part and parcel of Israeli society. It's true. There are tensions, especially in the binational cities. With the Palestinians, is a different story. The Palestinians are divided into two separate territorial units, which unfortunately are being ruled by two different political systems. The West Bank is controlled by the Palestinian Authority, with which Israel has a political dispute. Gaza is controlled by a terrorist organization called Hamas, which is very much like Al-Qaeda, ISIS, Boko Haram, Hezbollah, and the likes. It's an organization that does not recognize Israel, unlike the Palestinian Authority, interested in the annihilation of the state of Israel. It's a religious organization that is not interested at all in improving the lives of the Palestinians on the ground. This must be clear. Hamas is not about a better future for the Palestinians. The Palestinian Authority is, and therefore it is Israel's counterpart, it is Israel's partner for a deal. So I think that clarifies the issue for our viewers.
Yes, very good. Which ties into another question. I have a curiosity that I've just learned about. The Palestinian refugees. And someone was telling me about this the other day, and I said, well, what are they refugees from? And he said, oh, well, 1948. I said, well, that was 73 years ago. Well, and excuse my ignorance, why are there still refugees from a war from 73 years ago?
Yeah, that's a very sad chapter. You know that World War II created a global refugee crisis. There were many, many refugees, including my own family. The Jews that came from Arab countries. In my case, my mother's family came from Yemen. My father's family came from what is today Uzbekistan. It created a massive, massive refugee problem. The only group of refugees that was not settled yet, that their issue was not resolved yet, are the Palestinians. And there are several reasons for it. The first is they became a pawn in a much larger game. At first, it was the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union. Later on, it became the Israeli-Arab conflict, which was represented by an Arab demand to annihilate the state of Israel. The 1967 Khartoum summit, where the Arabs said no to all options of making peace, and the Arab economic boycott and so on. And later on, they became a victim, if you may, of a smaller conflict, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. So there are many forces, some of them mighty forces, that have no interest in resolving the Palestinian refugee crisis. And of course, the same way that they can say that they're children of refugees, I can say I'm a child of refugees. But that won't change anything. What we really need to do is be less obsessed with the past and look forward. No one really wants, despite of what some commentators in the American and the European media will say, no one in Israel wants to see the Palestinians suffer. However, what are the Israelis expected to do when they're being bombarded by deadly, lethal missiles coming in from the Gaza Strip? And I know this is the question of the day in the United States. A lot of people complain about Israeli disproportionate use of force. And the question is, what is disproportionate in war? I've seen combat, unfortunately, in my life. And I can tell you there is no such thing as disproportionate when you're at war. When someone is trying to kill you, there is no such thing as disproportionate. You try to do your best to avoid collateral damage, but you have to protect yourself.
Ambassador, I wish we had more time, sir. Can we do it again, please?
Oh,
Ido
absolutely,
Aharoni.
with pleasure, anytime.
Thank you. Ambassador Aharoni from New York University. Thank you, sir. Let's continue on.
Thank you.
Stand with Israel, get a little more insight into what's going on in these Palestinian territories. True story. Mike Slater, spread the word. Hey, Slater Crusaders, welcome back to our special Stand with Israel, defending democracy. I want to get to our next guest here, but before we do, we'll play this clip from AOC on the House floor, spouting more nonsense.
And the United States must acknowledge its role in the injustice and human rights violations of Palestinians. This is not about both sides. This is about an imbalance of power. If we're scared to stand up to the incarceration of children in Palestine, it's because maybe it'll force us to confront the incarceration of children here on our border. If by standing up to the injustices there, it will prompt us to stand up to the injustices here.
Lisa Daftari is here. She's from the Foreign Desk, which is foreigndesknews.com, Middle East counterterrorism expert, and editor-in-chief of the Foreign Desk. Lisa, how are you?
Doing well. How are you, Mike?
Good to talk to you. What are the human rights abuses that the Israelis/Americans are committing against the Palestinians?
This clip is so painful to listen to because it has so many just contextual errors. I mean, AOC couldn't place Israel on a map, let alone have the floor, have this platform to be spewing this garbage and then connecting it to our border. Look, no country is perfect, but obviously countries like the United States, like Israel, who pride themselves on being a democracy. I mean, there has to be some sort of, point of reference where she can make a differentiation between countries in Africa that are actually committing slavery, that are actually raping their children, that are actually incarcerating their children, and countries like Israel and the United States. So that's first and foremost. Secondly, she should not have a platform to be representing this country when she speaks, in such a dangerous and divisive way, and really gets all the facts wrong. Let's talk about the history of Israel and the way that they treat their children, their minorities, their gays. Look, we just started on Pride Week, we talk about rights, and the leftists get so riled up about Palestinian rights. Well, how about the rights of the marginalized in the Palestinian territories? How are gays treated? How are women treated? Can they dress the way that they want? Can they go out without a male escort entourage? Can they go out and be free? Can they post whatever they want on their Facebook pages? Can they speak out against Hamas? These are the questions. These are the freedoms that they're not afforded by their own government. Whereas if you compare that to the Arabs, the Palestinians who are living inside Israel, who have those rights to work, to live freely, to be gay, to be feminist, to be liberal, whatever they want. I mean, these are the truths and these are the nuances that are missing in today's coverage and the narrative that has been portrayed this time around, and always, I should say, but this time around during this escalation between Israel and Hamas.
So bizarre that the woke left supports these people and a culture and a government that is contrary to every value they say they hold dear. That is one of the most bizarre things that there is. New York Times ran a story the other day of all the kids that were killed by Israel recently. When you see a piece of propaganda like that, clearly from the Palestinian perspective merely, and without giving the proper context, what should we know? What should we know when we see an article about Palestinian kids killed?
Yeah, great question. When you see that, obviously it's a tearjerker, and everyone feels for the children. And look, you should know this, that the Hamas, the Palestinian leadership, has nothing to lose. Every time they enter into a conflict with Israel, it is not a military conflict. It is purely a PR, a public relations, a marketing, a propaganda conflict, meaning they are setting out only to set the stage for more abuse, violence, animosity, not just towards Israel, towards Zionists, towards Jews on the streets of New York and on the streets of Los Angeles and on the streets of London and Toronto and Montreal. That's what they're after. And that's exactly what they got. And the left fed right into this plan. The masterful thing that not just the Palestinian leadership, but those who carry this cause here in the United States have been able to do, and also throughout Europe, is to piggyback on all of these other social justice causes, this intersectionality that we talk about. So they send the message, if you care about gays, you should care about Palestinians. If you care about women's rights, you should care about Palestinians. Look at Linda Sarsour and how she inserted herself with the Women's March only to push this anti-Israel, I don't even call it pro-Palestinian, I just call it anti-Israel propaganda, because that is their number one goal, is to villainize not just Israel, but Jews. That's how this has come from anti-Zionism to anti-Semitism. That's how it has traveled to the United States. I mean, what does Israel and its policies have to do with people, thugs, going up to diners in a restaurant in Los Angeles or New York and saying, are you Jewish? They're not asking, do you agree with Bibi Netanyahu? They're not asking, do you agree with settlements? They're not asking, who do you believe the land belongs to? They're asking, are you Jewish? Now, that tells us a lot about that front page in the New York Times. That tells us a lot about the message that they're trying to send and this villainization that continues.
So I want to make sure I get this right, your claim that the Palestinian leadership has nothing to lose, so they kind of spark up these attacks, right? They indiscriminately fire rockets into Israel. Israel fires back. My understanding is a lot of these, the military in the Palestinian territories, they hide their weapons underneath schools and in tunnels underneath residential areas, stuff like that. So the Israeli rockets hit Palestinians, some kids die, and they only did that. The Palestinians only did that in order to show, look how terrible the Israelis are, and that sparks and increases anti-Semitism around the world. Am I putting those dots together properly?
Absolutely. What's going on over there has become pretense for what is going on around the world. There's an absolute connection. Look, this is not the first time we're seeing anti-Semitism. In 2019 and 2020, we saw an exponential increase in anti-Semitic attacks throughout the world, particularly in the United States, and New York being the number one place where we've seen increases, which is it's mind-boggling, right? Because you see New York having such a high population of Jews, the highest population outside of Israel, and having Jews being such a part of New York City and the culture, and being really believing themselves to be Americans first. And the interesting thing is that all we hear about are these children, and some more facts for you is that on the ground, yes, these weapons are placed in civilian places. They're actually placed in schools. These are schools that are funded by the UN and US taxpayer money, and there are weapons being hidden there. Second thing you should know is that the Israelis do their best. I'm not saying they're perfect, but they do their best to give warnings ahead of time where they're going to hit, because their goal is not to hit civilian areas. And if people want to compare numbers, all you hear about is the casualties. It's about 200 casualties on the Palestinian side and just about a dozen or so on the Israeli side. Well, yes, because Israelis put their civilians and children in bomb shelters out of harm's way when 4,300 rockets were fired into civilian areas in Israel, whereas the Israeli military did about 1,000 very targeted attack, giving, again, warnings along the way to get civilians out of harm's way. So if you want to compare the numbers, there are another set of numbers for you, 4,000 versus 1,000. I mean, the media doesn't talk about this. Another thing that the media doesn't talk about is, we just published this on the Foreign Desk today, is that the Palestinians have called for a day of rage for Friday, for there to be more attacks made against Israelis. Since the ceasefire has been in effect, there have been 2 other attacks on the borders. No one's talking about this, Mike. No one's covering this in the media. No one's going to cover the Day of Rage. No one's covering these attacks on the borders that have occurred after the ceasefire. Why? Because they're waiting for Israel to retaliate if they have to. And then it's going to begin. And then people like AOC and Ilhan Omar are going to take to the podium and say, oh, this is imbalanced. This is not fair. The two sides aren't equal. Well, yes, because we're not following the story along the way. And when you come into a movie in the middle of the movie and you watch these Palestinians being killed, well, yes, you will decide and judge a certain way. And I've never seen people in the United States, particularly on the left, take such a strong position on something going on in the Middle East without having the context, without having the history, without having any knowledge of what's going on. Why don't we have a strong opinion about what's going on in Ethiopia or, and in Belarus or in any other place where we're seeing, conflicts going on right now? No one's talking about it. Colombia, for example, Venezuela. Where are our strong opinions? Where are we taking to the streets on these issues?
Wow. Okay, so so why not? Is it just because this has to do with the Jews and it's all about anti-Semitism? Which is my other question. Is there any strategic advantage that the Palestinians had in firing rockets into Israel? Like, are they looking for anything on the ground? Or is it just, as we've been talking about, to increase anti-Semitism around the world?
Sure. What do they want, right? That's the main question. What do they want? Do they want a two-state solution? They were offered that many times. It was on the table. They didn't want it. Do they want a peace deal? It was offered many times, including under the Trump administration. They didn't want that. What do they want? What do they want? Do they want from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. That is a call for Israel to be completely wiped off the map. And if people don't believe that, you have to read the Hamas charters. You have to read what this group that is leading the Palestinians believes and what they want for the future of the Palestinian people. Do they want to live peacefully side by side? It doesn't look that way, Mike. They have been given so many offers for that kind of life, to be given that kind of freedom and peace. There was an interview with an IDF spokesperson where I think the journalist said, well, it's not fair because the Palestinians don't have an Iron Dome. And that Iron Dome, again, is a technology that Israel has that, protects it from these missiles coming down. And the IDF spokesperson said, sure, they do. Their Iron Dome is to stop shooting missiles into Israel. There will be peace. There will not be one missile, thrown into Gaza if they stop, if they put their weapons down. This will all be done. And that is really the bottom line message here. There will be peace if they want peace.
Last question, Lisa. The people who are leading the Palestinians, whether it's the PLO or Hamas, are they motivated by genuine religious reasons as their pretense, or do you think it's purely just a secular power grab? What's motivating them, the leaders?
Yeah, look at all of these dictators in the Middle East, whether it's the Iranian regime or Bashar al-Assad in Syria. It was Saddam Hussein before in Iraq. And now if you look at the PLO and you look at I should say you should look at Hamas first and foremost, a terror organization that is leading a people that want for peace, they want life, they want basic needs. The Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt almost had a minute there, but they were taken out, thankfully. These are all about the power grab. It's about abusing religion to control the masses. It's about having the infallible voice and really staying in power. That's the way that these dictators stay in power for such a long time, because they cannot be taken down, and then they make the people rely on them. They rely on them for everything. That's what the Arab Spring was all about. It was about waking up and the people of that region saying, we want more, we want better. And the internet and social media has a lot to do with that. They see that other people have it better. The Abraham Accords doubled down on what the Arab Spring started. The Abraham Accords brought that sense of, we can have a future, we can have prosperity, we can join with a country like Israel that is forward thinking, they have the technology, they have the know-how, they're a democratic state, and we're going to go forward with them. And many of these modern Arab states decided to sign on to a better future. And guess what? That first offer for something like the Abraham Accords was offered to the Palestinians. I was there. I was at the White House when the plans were being drawn up. A handful of journalists like myself were invited to see the plan before it was unveiled and presented to the Palestinians, and it was dead on arrival. They didn't even want to see it. And that's really, that's what it's going to come down to. If people want a better future for the Palestinians, whether you're a leftist protester or you're an actual Palestinian, it's going to come down to the actual leadership to want a better future for the people. And it's within their reach. They just have to want it.
Lisa Daftari, foreigndesknews.com. Lisa, thank you for your voice and your journalism. Appreciate you.
My pleasure.
Wonderful day. Coming up next, Lisa mentioned the technology. We're going to come back and talk about the secular reasons, if you will, as to why America and Israel just make natural allies. Talk about that coming up next. True story. Mike Slater, spread the word. Hey, Slater Crusaders, welcome back to the final segment of our special Stand with Israel, defending democracy. In this segment, I want to talk about why Israel and America, it just makes sense that we are natural allies with each other. I want to start the segment with this clip, though, from the founder of Black Lives Matter, Marxist, of course, Patrisse Cullors. This is her at Harvard Law School back in 2015. Her views haven't changed in the last 6 years. Here's what she said.
Actions always. The other thing I'll say is Palestine is our generation South Africa. And if we don't step up boldly and courageously to end the imperialist project that's called Israel, we're doomed.
Amazing. As a gay woman, I don't think she'd make it very long with Hamas and Charles. Charles Mizrahi is here. He is the host of the Charles Mizrahi Show and the founder of Alpha Investor. Charles, how are you, sir?
Oh, great, man. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, let's start off with that point, just about progressives and their odd support of the Palestinians. What do you make of that?
It's totally ridiculous, absolutely ridiculous. You know, any of these Instagrammers, as social media stars, or even people like her, if they wouldn't live, you know, Bill Maher said they wouldn't last a day in Gaza. I don't think they last an hour. There are a couple of reasons. One is women don't have much rights in Gaza and in the Palestinian territories. In fact, in Gaza, a woman can't even travel alone. Homosexuality is punishable by 10 years. That's the penal code, 10 years. For men, and there's honor killings, there's violence against women. And why would the progressives go to a place which is a totalitarian state, oppressing those who were the minority, the women and gays, and villainize a free democratic state like Israel? It makes absolutely no sense. And what she said was absolutely ridiculous. If Israel is an apartheid state, there is an Israeli Arab members of Knesset, Israeli Arabs in all facets of the economy, as well as there are judges, there are lawyers, there are mixed neighborhoods. So either she never went to Israel or never went to South Africa, or probably both, because she has no idea what she's talking about.
All right, I got two questions about that. Talking about these Israeli Arabs, when I first learned about this blew my mind and blew the top off the whole thing, right? It'd be one thing if this like Gaza was all Arabs and Israel was all Jews and that's it. But that's not it. Tell us what's really going on in Israel when it comes to the people who are there.
You know, first of all, Jews cannot live in Gaza or any of the Palestinian territories. So you want to talk about apartheid? If you're a Jew, you cannot live there. There are 0 Jews in Gaza. There are 0 Jews in the Palestinian territories. Number two, Israeli Arabs make up a vital part of Israeli society. They serve in the military. There's over 1,000 recently, more than double over the previous years, according to the IDF, almost double the amount of Arab citizens, Arab Israeli citizens, Muslim, serving in the Israel Defense Forces. Israel has Bedouins, Israel has Jews, Israel has Israeli Arab Christians, Israeli Arab Muslims. So if you're an Israeli Arab, you have more rights in Israel than you have in any other Arab country, bar none. Period. End of sentence. That is a fact. That is a fact. There is no discrimination in terms of when you could vote, where you could live, or anything to that extent.
Let's go back to the first point you brought up. Let's try to make sense of it. Why do far left progressives in America and around the world hate or support these Palestinian and people and Hamas ultimately? Do they hate Jews that much? Are they that anti-Semitic that nothing else matters over that?
Well, I ask you, right? We saw in New York City, in LA, in cities throughout Europe. Palestinian protesters marching with flags saying death to the Jews. Not death to the Israeli, death to the Jews. I'm Jewish and I live in New York. I'm not an Israeli. An Israeli may not be a Jewish. They could be an Arab. Why death to the Jews? What does that have to do with anything? And it basically takes off the duplicity and the stupidity of the progressive left, which we're saying for years that you could be anti-Zionist and not anti-Semitic, which is impossible. To think about any other country in the world, if you said, I'm against Italians living in Italy or French living in France, but I love French people and I love Italian people. How is that even possible? Out of the 40 territorial conflicts throughout the world, the progressives should ask, why do you care so much about Israel and the Palestinian territories and Gaza, which was turned back to Hamas in 2005? Why are you focusing there? Why are you chanting in the streets from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free? Do you know what's between the river and the sea? The Mediterranean and the Jordan River? Israel. By saying from the river to the sea, you're basically saying you want to wipe out the state of Israel. My question is why?
Especially when a lot of these progressives saying this would not be welcome there if they were successful.
And progressives, let me just jump in one point. And progressives, at any whiff of prejudice, anywhere, they're out in force. But when there's prejudice against Jews, silence.
So why should America be allies with Israel?
Why should America be allies with Israel? Give me one reason why they shouldn't be. 1948, 11 minutes after the state of Israel is declared, Harry Truman, president of the United States, immediately recognizes the state of Israel. And for the past 73 years, Israel has been America's staunchest ally. 9/11, remember, the Palestinians were dancing in the street handing out sweets. Israel was mourning. Israel is in a very bad neighborhood of the Middle East, and Israel is the only democracy amongst 20 some odd Arab countries. America's support for Israel goes both ways. Israel is amazing in what they're doing in research and technology, military technology as well, which they're sharing. The Mossad, the Israeli intelligence services, the intelligence it shares with the rest of the world is vital. How could America not have Israel as an ally, as being the democracy and with the same ideals of freedom that the United States has?
Correct me if I'm wrong in my interpretation of it. I see, the Democrats in power, it's kind of like sort of supporting, like we're there, but we're not unfriendly, but we're not right. We're kind of doing this thing, as opposed to President Trump, who was like all in, like we're all in on Israel. Do you believe we should have that posture as Americans?
Well, look, let's be real about this. History has shown us that dictators, bullies, terrorists go against weak leaders, not strong leaders. When President Trump moved the embassy, rightfully so, Israel's embassy, to its capital, to David's capital, the capital that's over 3,000 years ago in the Bible, just pick it up. King David found that there was no other peoples. It was Israel's capital since the time of King David. And when President Trump moved the embassy back to Jerusalem, peep, not a word. That was it. A couple of protests for a half hour, I think it was a couple hours, and that was it. Soon as President Trump is out of office, a weak leader is in place, and the Arabs get emboldened. And you know what? Why shouldn't they? President Biden gave them $200 million, which they took immediately, and they're using for fantastic things like sending missiles over to kill Israeli citizens. Hamas is using money that they have, which they say, I think was Forbes, listed them as the third richest terrorist organization, $700 million. Yet their people in Gaza, and remember, Israel gave back Gaza in 2005. So Gaza is controlled by Hamas. Zero Israelis there. And they're taking that money and they're taking it, instead of building schools and hospitals, they're building missiles. So bottom line, when you have weak leadership, you embolden terrorists, you embolden dictators, you embolden Iran to continue on in their work of securing a nuclear bomb with the sole threat to wipe, which is, they stated many times, to wipe out the state of Israel. There is no other country in the United Nations where one member state wants to annihilate the other, except Iran, and the world sits quietly with that. How the heck is that possible? Not only quietly, President Biden wants to resume talks with Iran. even though they're about 60% enriching uranium already, which 2 to 3% is all you need for commercial. So everyone agrees that this is for weapons grade. My question is, why? Why are you letting these terrorists be emboldened for the sole purpose of creating terror and destruction throughout the world, and specifically to Jews wherever they are?
And they're explicit about it. Can you tell us, give us some insight into Israel's economy, their technology, their healthcare? It's such a small country, but they do so much there.
It's amazing, startup nation. This is a country which has very few natural resources, but their resource is human capital. Every major tech company has a presence there: Google, Microsoft, Intel. Warren Buffett even made his first venture and bought a company outside of the United States, and it was an Israeli company, Iskar, several years ago. In fact, it was during the Lebanese war. So here you have a people who want to develop, who want to be, what the Bible says, the light unto the nations, and create innovation in terms of medicine, in terms of aid throughout the world, in agriculture, and helping the desert bloom and sharing that technology with countries that can't grow crops. Israel is helping them do that. So here you have a nation, when left alone by threats of annihilation, do outstanding and amazing work and welcomes their neighbors. The Arab Accords, which already 4 Arab countries have already made peace with Israel, they see that siding with terror doesn't work. So they want to latch onto this, which rightly so, into this economic boom and advancement of their societies and benefiting all of their citizens by attaching onto Israel. The Palestinians should put this all aside and say, enough already. We've had failed leadership for so many years. They've been offered this, their own state close to 20 times since 1937, and every single time they turned it down. Every single time. You get more, basically, for your citizens, your population, your culture, by aligning yourself with a country that wants to help you grow instead of continually trying to annihilate it. It doesn't work.
We're at the run here, sir, and I know the answer to this question. I think I do, but I genuinely don't know. Are there any of these technology industries in Gaza? Is there any productive economic growth in Gaza?
Well, the per capita in Gaza is $1,800. Hamas is worth at least $700 million. Where's all that money going? It's going to build tunnels in order to infiltrate Israel. It's missiles, 4,300 of them sent over, and in population centers. So where is that money going? Basically to their leadership and to terrorize and kill as many Israeli civilians as possible. There's no reason why they can't. Thousands of people, thousands of Palestinians cross over every day into Israel to work and part of the labor force. And if they would just put down their arms and put down their threat and actual act of trying to kill Israeli citizens, that whole region would be uplifted.
Yeah. Charles Mizrahi, host of the Charles Mizrahi Show and founder of Alpha Investor. Charles, thanks for your insights, sir.
Well, my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Appreciate you. Stand with Israel. Defend democracy. That's our special. America's the greatest country in the world. Stand by Israel. Spread the word.